This is Captains of Industry coming to you from the Durban ICC, where the World Economic Forum, the 27th World Economic Forum in Africa, is taking place. I'm speaking to Kweku Bedu-Addo, who is the incoming CEO of Standard Chartered Southern Africa region. Kweku, thanks so much for your time. I think we've got to start, given the fact that we are here at the World Economic Forum, on your thoughts of the summit over the last 3 days.
Well, I think the theme of the summit, achieving inclusive growth, is very appropriate for the times that Africa finds itself, and indeed the global economy, with rising trade barriers, rise of nationalism, disruption in trade patterns, burgeoning population, unemployment, disruption from technology. Clearly, Africa needs to do something to ensure that growth is inclusive. It creates jobs for the teeming youth that are coming up. So I think that it's a very appropriate topic. We've talked about trade, how to reduce the trade, cost of trade for SMEs who are at the base of the pyramid, who generate jobs for the people. So I think that it's good. The issue is, can we execute? You know, lots of good ideas I've heard in the last 3 days. The question is execution.
And it always is execution. Having been attending the forum for some 7 years now, the overriding question comes to the implementation and moving beyond the dialogue.
Yeah.
It's a tough scenario for Africa, though. At the moment, we're looking at a growth rate of 1.3% for the 2016 period, up marginally in terms of forecasts for 2018 at around 2.6%, according to the World Bank. And it's very difficult to have that discussion of inclusive growth when you have very little growth in the first instance in the economy.
Well, I personally think that there's a lot of potential that can be unleashed if the reform agenda within Africa can be increased somewhat and intensified and fine-tuned. I think that Africa benefited a lot from the reforms of the 80s, where there was more liberalization and state receded from certain aspects of the economy. I think that they need to go back to the drawing board. I've spent some time working in the public sector, and from what I gleaned there, and plus my time in the private sector, and I happen to also sit on the investment committee for Acumen Fund, which does impact investing around the world. So I've seen all the extremes.
All sides of the story.
I've seen all sides of the story, and I'm convinced that if all sides sit down and dialogue, we can unleash more value and create more jobs for people and make the growth more inclusive, because technology may not make the growth inclusive unless there's deliberate human intervention, and that requires dialogue and serious dialogue and good execution.
Let's talk about Standard Chartered's commitment to the African continent, and you've played a number of different roles within the Standard Chartered fold, spanning some 17 years. If we talk about this regional story now, I mean, you've been in Zambia and East Africa and headed up the Standard Chartered operation in that territory, and so too in Ghana, the portfolio before the portfolio you are taking on now. Do you think that we are actually at a point where we are having the regional conversation around South Africa rather than the 54 individual countries that make up the African continent? Well,
first of all, last year Standard Chartered issued a bold statement to the market under our Here for Africa campaign. We think that the Africa region is important, and we are making counter-cyclical investments into Africa at a time when everyone is pulling back and hesitant. We're committing to the continent. The first initiative is Power. So the Power Africa campaign by President Obama. Standard Chartered has committed $5 billion towards that project. I think it's important to put energy across the continent, because that's what is going to propel growth. We have also committed to invest in digital in a big way in our retail banking, where our investment is beginning to pay off by way of the user interface, user initiation, direct 24 hours access by users. So that is going to revolutionize the retail banking, online banking, and mobile banking in a big way. The investments have already been done, demonstrating our commitment to Africa. If you come to Southern Africa, we think that South Africa is a big economy, second biggest economy in Africa, and it has a pull factor for the region in terms of its potential. It's a well-diversified economy as well, relative to other economies. So you'll see that whilst other economies have taken massive shocks by way of the commodity down cycle, South Africa is slightly more resilient, and it can build upon that potential and be a growth hub for the rest of the region. So within the Southern Africa region, we have Mauritius, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, each with its own potential and
I've got to jump in here, because if you look at the three biggest economies on the African continent, South Africa, Nigeria, Angola. Now, you've just mentioned South Africa and Angola as being part of your portfolio. These economies are in tough times, if I can use that phrasing. So you've got a big challenge. Does that unnerve you, given that they are your responsibility from a Standard Chartered perspective?
No, it doesn't unnerve me. Standard Chartered has experience in emerging markets across the world, and some of the problems that we see are cyclical, some of the problems are structural. The important thing is, what is the policy response? We have a fantastic sovereign solutions team in London that works with the team on the ground to offer thought leadership, ratings advisory, investor relations support to sovereigns. You would recognize that some of the sovereigns within Africa are transitioning from low income to low middle income. They're moving from the traditional reliance on Bretton Woods institutions, concessionary debt, to more commercial debt. That comes with a certain market discipline and transparency, and it's a learning curve for them. And Standard Chartered has partnered at least 5 economies within Africa with ratings advisory, debt and capital market solutions. And so we can do that in this region as well. There's no reason why we can't support them.
With the negative headlines around an economy like South Africa at the moment, present across the world, what do your peers ask you about the South African context? And is there a sense that perhaps Standard Chartered should look to reduce its visibility in South Africa? Have you had that conversation with any of your peer group within the Standard Chartered fold? Are they concerned? And here I'm really just referring to the international news that abounds about South Africa at the moment.
Well, the international news, but on the ground, we see South Africa as a very resilient and diversified economy with opportunity. So we see the opportunity. Naturally, there are risks, as there are in any other geography or jurisdiction. It's not, whatever we see in South Africa is not unique or germane to South Africa. It's very common around the world. The issue is, what is the response and how well you manage whatever risks that you perceive. But I don't see South Africa as being any different from other countries.
The relationship, we've got the German federal finance minister here, Wolfgang Schäuble, and he's launched under his G20 presidency, or under Germany's G20 presidency rather, the G20 Compact with Africa, which really is going to drive private investment in the infrastructure space specifically. Do you think we're going to see take-up from African countries in terms of utilizing that G20 platform for the visibility, garnering the G20 political will to drive investments into their respective economies?
I expect them to take advantage, but I also hope that they do not underestimate the requirements or the policy refinements that may be required of them in exchange for capital.
Specifically with G20 countries.
Yes, because capital doesn't come cheap, and capital is being sought all over the world. Okay, so I would hope that African policymakers don't have the entitlement mentality, but rather have the policy reform orientation to do what is right, to continue to attract capital in a more sustainable manner, even beyond this initiative by the German government.
I want to come back to banking, the financial services environment, and specifically Standard Chartered. Regulation has been on the increase in the banking space, given the 2008-2009 financial downturn. Do you feel that the regulation at this point is too stringent, that it's going to stifle growth within the banking environment?
I think it's all about balance at the end of the day, and the banking community needs to earn the trust of regulators and the general public, and to correct the errors of the past, which the industry itself is undergoing a lot of self-regulation and reform. Compliance agenda is very high on the list of any bank, any well-managed bank. Compliance and conduct is very high on the agenda. So I expect that over time, the banks will regain the trust of the public, and hopefully maybe a bit more balancing of the regulations on banks, ease up the regulations a bit. But I can understand where the regulator is coming from as well, because I think regulators around the world don't want a situation where banking collapse leads to taxpayers, a burden on taxpayers. So there are some positives coming out of the whole crisis, and I think learning point for future generations about what to do and what not to do in the area of banking.
Let's drill down now into your personal journey. Captains of Industry really gives the audience the opportunity to understand the man behind the company. 17 years I referred to earlier within the Standard Chartered fold, and I'm sure many viewers at the moment thinking, that's fantastic track record. How do I climb the proverbial ladder? Which is, I'm sure, something that you get asked on a regular basis, and you've done it very effectively. So what are the lessons to being so successful in corporate?
I think the first thing is you must have a broad knowledge base, okay? And you don't always have to start from banking. I didn't start from banking. I rather started from policy. So I did public sector work for close to a decade, about 7 years, which I learned a lot about how government works, the inner plumbings of government, policy, the finance ministry. That was a huge advantage for me when I moved into the private sector. Within the private sector itself, it's also about the ability to solve problems for clients, to be able to reach out to clients, to build trust, a trusting relationship with clients. It's also about developing yourself and aspiring for leadership roles when they become available and taking advantage. And it's also about being able to lead people. If you aspire to climb the corporate ladder, then you must make the necessary investment in terms of personal choices and personal development, in terms of leading people to create value. That is the trick. The
key themes here: responsible and responsive leadership. In light of what you've just said about the right type of leadership required in corporate, how would you put that into a similar phrase with the responsive and responsible leadership? So unpack that statement that in the current situation, Africa needs responsive and responsible leadership.
Well, the first thing the first box I'll take for leaders is to protect and uphold dignity of the populace, the general population, in which case all the policies, public policy choices must uphold the dignity of the people. That is very critical. I think that when you price in dignity, it tackles a lot of the problems that you see on the ground by way of poverty, by way of unemployment, a lot of the social problems. If you price in dignity as leadership and see that you owe it to society as a social contract, then you elevate the standard of your governance. So that's number one. Number two would be integrity in office. That is very key. Integrity and transparency to promote trust. And that works whether you're in the public sector or in the private sector. If the followers perceive that you're opaque in your practices, it generates mistrust and sometimes resentment down the organization. So as leaders, we always have to remember to create transparent systems around us. People should see clearly what we're doing, how we're leading, the examples we're setting, and that builds trust and snowballs into a virtuous cycle as opposed to the opposite.
Just looking at your history, you've moved across the continent and you've worked in Singapore, but I think it's more about the continent and how you have managed to eliminate issues of nationality. And now you're moving into the Southern African region, which again will incorporate Zambia, as you clearly put it. What is the secret to that? Because we make so much about, the 54 countries in Africa, and is there any lesson that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think that you have to embrace culture wherever you go. Be open-minded, embrace the local culture. People value and treasure their culture. So when you move into a new country or a new destination, it's important to get to understand, get a feel of the culture, demonstrate genuine enthusiasm for the culture, and that kind of wins people over, and they will cooperate with you, and you settle into the role, because you still need to work through people to achieve results, and they only work with you and for you and deliver for you depending on how well they trust you and how well they can relate with you. So that's an important aspect of going on international assignments.
Singapore. Talk to me about your experience in Singapore and lessons of best practice, specifically in the financial services industry, that you can deploy in Africa.
I think Singapore is a country I admire so much for the reason I admire any society that can achieve social transformation within the shortest possible time. And I think it's one of the best examples in the world. And so it's the precision and the rigor of policy there, and the dialogue with private sector, between public sector and private sector. And sometimes the lines are blurred even in terms of the sharpness of the focus and the aspiration in the policies and everything. Is something to be admired, and that's something that I learned from Singapore for the time that I spent there.
You have given us an overview of Southern Africa as incoming CEO. What are the opportunities, and I know you've got to take time to assess the environment, but what are the opportunities that stand out at this very early stage for you in your portfolio, your new country portfolio?
Well, there are a number of power projects, obviously. Energy is big in Africa because a lot of countries now have an energy deficit. So you see a lot of power investments, and we are involved in a couple. We also see the commodities. It's expected that the commodity prices will pick up again. And as they pick up, I think that more investment will come back into the region. So power space, commodity space, definitely. We're looking at other areas that can possibly also influence growth. For example, health sector, education sector. There are some opportunities there that involve public-private partnerships, but which also have meaningful impact on the population and our impact as a bank on the countries which we would like to explore.
From a country perspective, many would say Mauritius could potentially be something that you may be very excited about, given the fact that the country is trying to establish itself as let's just say, the Singapore of Africa.
Yeah, Mauritius, I think, is exciting as a financial center. They're quite advanced in what they've achieved. They're trying to compete with the world's financial centers. They've successfully signed double taxation agreements with 15 countries in Africa already, and positioned themselves well as a platform, as a conduit for investment flows, be they foreign direct investment or portfolio investment into and out of Africa. So I think it's a very well-placed country. Again, relatively well diversified, well managed, and it's a very promising market that I'm excited to be associated with.
Is it too early to ask you for your vision as you take on the Southern African portfolio within the Standard Chartered fold?
Yes and no. I mean, no in the sense that ultimately my mandate is to make sure that the Southern Africa region delivers superior shareholder value, which is above our cost of capital at the end of the day. We need to achieve that, and in achieving that, we still need to achieve that by satisfying our clients and our customers, by respecting regulations across the markets, and to offer thought leadership to the markets that we operate in. So those are overarching principles that we must always achieve wherever we are. The rest I'll fine-tune as I get more familiar with the region.
I've also got to come to a personal question which I put to all the captains of industry sitting in that hot seat. And again, it's about sharing advice to those people who aspire to enjoy the success that you've managed to achieve. How do you look at the sense of balance? Is there such a thing as balance?
Yes, there is. Everything in moderation, including moderation itself, is how I will sum it up.
Can I push you a little bit further
Sure.
on that? Is it possible to have family, to be the CEO of an organization and kind of tick all the boxes?
Well, I don't know what you mean by tick all the boxes. No one is perfect, but you can strive for balance and equilibrium. I think you can always tell when a person is in equilibrium or not in equilibrium. So there's no perfect spot where you are in perfect balance at any time. But I think just the effort to stay as close as possible to personal equilibrium helps you to give of your best, both to your organization or in your profession, as well as in your personal life and in your family.
And I think that's really a great answer that our audience will appreciate. It's a realistic answer. With Friday being the last day of the World Economic Forum, what is it that, after all your engagements and your discussions, what is it that you walk away with? Has it been a worthwhile experience? It
has. The networking has been fantastic. I've had the opportunity to meet new people, new organizations. Some have reached out to me, I've reached out to some. I've participated in some of the plenaries. I have been on one of the panels. And clearly there's a desire to achieve change and progress in Africa at a faster pace. And people from the millennial generation that I've heard speak have all made a very common statement that we are in a hurry, we are impatient. Now, they represent millions out there, large swathes of African population who are impatient to see progress and development come to them. And so it puts the onus back on leadership, on policymakers, on captains of industry to work together to create that environment that creates growth, spurs on growth. And that will not come automatically, you know. And I think that's the point, that the message that I'd like to get out there: dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. Policymakers need to sit down with other stakeholders, private sector, regulatory community, and dialogue. How do we take this continent forward so that growth becomes inclusive? If we can do that, then we're in good business for the next generation.
Perfect place to end our interview. Kweku, thank you so much for your time. I've been chatting to Kweku Bedu-Addo, who is the incoming CEO of Standard Chartered Southern African region, and we're coming to you from the World Economic Forum in Durban at the ICC, and this is the 27th World Economic Forum on Africa.